Hello again. This week I want to talk a little bit about a topic that's discussed in Chapter 2, and it's also the focus of your critical thinking question. That is the topic of checks and balances. As you've hopefully already read in Chapter 2, the system of checks and balances is part of our Constitution. It was not a new idea in the Constitution. Other governments had it before us, and it was discussed in some of the theoretical uh, writings that the framers of our Constitution had read in their education. These were ideas that came out of what was called the Enlightenment in European history. The idea behind checks and balances was to limit the power of government so that government would not take away people's rights. That was a chief concern of the framers in drafting the Constitution. So they did fragment governmental power. They broke it up into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch has responsibility for making the laws of our land. The executive branch carries out the laws, and the job of the judicial branch, which is our court system, is to interpret those laws and ultimately to have some say in whether those laws should continue to be applied. So the framers set up this system. If you look on page 35 in your book, you'll actually see an outline of this process and the various examples of how the branches check and balance each other. One example of checks and balances is the authority of the president to veto bills passed by Congress. So, for example, Congress has lawmaking authority, but no bill passed by Congress can become law unless one of two things happens. One is the president signs it and it becomes law. But another example of how a bill can become law is the Congress passes it, sends it to the president vetoes it, sends the bill back to Congress, and at that point the Congress can try to override the veto with a two-thirds majority. It's not easy to do that, but it does happen from time to time. Just a couple of months ago, Congress did override one of President Obama's vetoes. So that's an example of checks and balances: presidential veto of a bill and the effort by Congress to override a veto, which can happen but doesn't happen often. One other example I wanted to mention was the authority of the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of laws, which is called judicial review. That means the Supreme Court has the authority to strike down a law that's been passed by Congress if they believe it violates some provision of the Constitution. I should mention that the Supreme Court does not voluntarily go in on its own and look at laws that have been passed, but rather it waits for someone to challenge a law, and then if it decides to take the case where someone has challenged the law, they will then take a look at it and decide, yes, this does fit with the Constitution, or no, it doesn't. And again, that's called judicial review. In the question you're going to be addressing in the critical thinking assignment, you're looking at whether you think this is a good thing, a bad thing, or a neutral thing for our democracy. In the question, and I'm just talking here about the checks and balances system, in the question I include the example of the passage and attempted repeal of the Affordable Care Act. That is the law that's also known as Obamacare. It's the health care law that was passed in 2010. Please read the question. It has more information on what's happened with that law over the last several years. The reason it's very timely now is because the Congress is considering another repeal of the law. They've been unsuccessful in the past in getting it repealed because President Obama possessed the ability to veto those repeals. But starting on January 20th, Donald Trump will be president, and he has already promised to sign a repeal bill if it comes to his desk. And it seems pretty likely that that's going to happen in the next couple of months, and it's very much in the news. So I included that as an example in the question. I don't want you to focus on whether the Affordable Care Act is a good thing or a bad thing. Each of us has our opinion about it. The question is really about how this is an illustration of whether checks and balances is a good thing or a bad thing for our democracy. Obviously, there have been efforts to repeal this law through the system of checks and balances, but because the president can veto a bill passed by Congress, the system of checks and balances has prevented any repeal from occurring, just as 7 years ago, when the Democrats had control of Congress and the presidency, there was really very little way in which the Republicans could push back on the passage of the law. So again, the focus of the question is not whether the Affordable Care Act is good or bad for our democracy. It's whether checks and balances is good or bad for our democracy, or neutral. People have different thoughts about whether it frustrates the government too much to have the system of checks and balances, or whether it is appropriate that we have this system to protect the rights of individuals. So please make sure you read the question carefully. And again, I don't want you to focus on your views of the law, and you don't even have to include the discussion of the Affordable Care Act in your answer. I just wanted to include that as an example of how this process has played out in the last couple of years on one very important issue in our country. So if you have any questions about the assignment, please ask. This is your first week doing a critical thinking assignment. Essentially, you're going to be writing a 200-word essay in response to the question that I posted. So if you have any questions, please email me, and good luck on the work this week. And I will see you next week.